All right, hey, thanks for tuning in. Welcome to the No Homework Book Club. This third episode, we're going to be going over estimating with user story points, which I think is always a popular topic and things that people are interested to learn more about. So hopefully, this is useful information to you. Thanks for checking it out. Before we get started, I just want to ask that if you like the video, please click the thumbs up button on YouTube. It would be great and help me get some natural traffic from YouTube search on this thing. And I also have a goal for the channel for our first subscriber. So that could be you. If you're interested, hit subscribe and check out what we've got coming up. I'm going to keep doing book reviews on Agile literature. We'll be doing some kind of code walkthroughs on full stack JavaScript applications that I'm currently studying and building right now. And then also we've got the Tech Talk series where we're going to talk with people in the industry that I've met throughout my career and just kind of going through what it's like to work in software development as an industry. And those ones are really fun. So yeah, without further ado, we'll get into the presentation. All right, No Homework Book Club. Let's see what we got. We're covering the book Agile Estimating and Planning right now. If you haven't read it and you are interested, check it out. They are a little bit pricey, but if you can find used ones, it's good. But they're available on Amazon and such. Anything in the Robert C. Martin series also looks pretty cool. So, I've read a couple of books from this series, and they were all really great. So check them out. There might be a topic that you're interested in if this one isn't appealing. So, all right. I'm going to go through a quick agenda. It's going to be hopefully short and sweet, but we'll go through user story points. There's a couple of analogies. We'll do a restaurant analogy, dog analogy. We'll talk about velocity, and then some closing thoughts. All right. Let's get into the restaurant analogy. So, chapter 4 opens up describing this scenario. Suppose a new restaurant opens up nearby and you decide that you want to try it. You can have a cup or a bowl of soup. You can have the entree as a full or a half portion. And you can have a small or a large soda. Right? So, what are you going to order? And how are you going to think about the portions that you're getting? Mike Cohn is basically getting at the point that you don't necessarily need exact metrics on this stuff to order food. You've sort of gotten used to this concept of just general sizing. That's sort of relative sizing as well. Small soda is smaller than a large soda. We don't know exactly what size they are, but it still works. It's still good enough. And so nobody's gonna say, I'd like 14 ounces of soda, 6 ounces of lasagna, and 3 ounces of bread, please. Said no one ever. Although when I came to thinking about it, I could think of a few exceptions to that rule. Anyway, the point of user story points is that it's all relative, man. We don't need to know whether, what specific length of time something is going to take. All we need to know is whether this story is larger or smaller than other stories that we're working on, and maybe if it's about the same level of effort as something that we've done before. That's the general concept when we're looking at sizing software tasks, otherwise described as user stories. Yeah. So the raw values are not important. The relative value does matter, though. So in theory, basically a 2-point story should be twice as much effort as a 1-point story. Now, we're not talking strictly about the amount of time that it takes, though. So the number of story points associated with the story represents the overall size of the story. There's not a set formula for that. Rather, the story point estimate is an amalgamation of the amount of effort involved in developing the feature, the complexity of developing it, the risk, the testing, the deployment tasks, anything, all of the above basically needs to be considered when we're looking at it. To further illustrate this, I'm going to talk about the dog analogy. Right? And so instead of story points, let's talk about dog points for a moment. A former colleague of mine had an even better example than the one shown in the book, which was if you think about what is the level of effort involved in giving a dog a haircut, right? So Mike Cohn, the author of this book, he talks about let's rate these dogs based on their size, and that's a good example, but I like the haircut analogy even better because we're not just looking at the size of the dog. The size has a lot to do with how much time it's going to take to actually give a dog a haircut, but we have to think of other things as well, like what is that dog's temperament? What is the density of the fur? What kind of haircut are we giving it? So you might say that maybe the dachshund is the easiest, it's the number one, and maybe the poodle might be like an 8 dog points haircut because it has all its kind of like fancy pompadour thing going on. Um, the Saint Bernard might be kind of crazy. I don't actually know. I don't think I've ever met a Saint Bernard in real life, but I grew up watching the movie Beethoven, so I just imagine like you'll get drooled all over. So maybe we'll give the Saint Bernard 13 story points or dog points. Um, that's kind of the concept here. I won't go through pointing them all, but think about for a moment that there are many different factors that need to be taken into consideration about how challenging, how difficult is something to actually execute. And while we were on the topic of dogs, it made me think of Exhibit. Yo dog, heard you like to estimate software projects, so we put the Fibonacci sequence in your project management system. I've already called out a few of these numbers in the previous slide, but although you don't have to do this, you can really do pointing with any set of numbers that you decide upon with your team. That's not super important. However, the Fibonacci sequence is often used because it skips over some of the numbers just to basically say that as things become bigger, there's more unknowns in them. So instead of having very granular details of all of the integers between 1 and 13, we sort of jump from 3 to 5, 5 to 8, and 8 to 13. And typically a team is not going to use anything bigger than a 13 unless they're talking about something that is really, really big. In other words, it's more work than we can really do in our 2-week or 3-week iteration. So they might be pointed at like 21, or sometimes people throw like just a big number like 100 or something like that. And all that it means is it's just a placeholder value to say that this thing is too big for us to really bite off and chew, and it needs to be broken down into smaller tasks. There's another chapter in this book about how to do that effectively. So I won't get into the details of that. That'll be an upcoming episode. But 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, those are the typical numbers you'll see. And lately, the teams that I've been working on, we've even thrown out 13. We just kind of work 1 through 8 in the Fibonacci sequence and use those as the basis for determining an 8 is basically maximum capacity for at least an individual or a group of people working on it within a 2-week iteration. All right, so that's a little bit about what the story points are. They're a little bit ethereal in terms of how you want to pick things, and the important thing with that is don't get too hung up on it. um, about what you're picking. Oftentimes, it's just really good to keep in mind making sure that things that are smaller numbers, they are smaller level of effort than things with bigger numbers. And if they're not exact, it's really it'll come out in the wash over time. And when we're talking about story points over time, we're talking about velocity. So let's check out velocity. All right. This is the the whole point of how to use velocity. And great, I've got some junk boilerplate in my presentation. Sorry about that. Anyways, step one, you want to sum up the total number of story points that your team has completed. Make sure that it's completed within each sprint. And that's an important metric to start tracking because it helps you figure out how much you want to do in your next iteration. So step two is use historical trends to plan how much work to commit to in a new sprint. So we did 30 story points last sprint. For this next sprint planning, let's do 30 points as well. You can also pull some levers there if you're in a more managerial or leadership role for the team. If you think like, hey, we're not really doing as much as we're capable of doing, you can try to push the team to maybe do 32 points, maybe do 35 points. Try to increase that. Now, there will be a certain like cruising altitude that your team reaches, and maxing it out beyond that, it's not always good to continue growing that forever and ever. You just have to use a little bit of professional acumen to decide if your team is reached its cruising altitude yet, or if there's still gains to be made there. But that being said, you'll start to trend it out. I think it's good to use the most recent 3 iterations and get the average of those. So if you're starting a brand new team, or if your team has recently undergone staff changes, or if they have started a totally new project that's very outside of the norm for the work they've been engaged with previously, you might have to reset the baseline. And at this point, you're just kind of taking a best guess until you start to get historical data. And this works also not just for the iteration, but for the individual user stories that you're sizing. So story A, we might think about, hey, is this actually more or less challenging than this story we did last sprint? Or is it about the same? And you can use that as a basis for helping to coach teams and deciding what number do you want to slap on there. At the end of the day, it is an estimate. It's not a guarantee of any particular amount of time it will take. But if you're doing it well and you're starting to get good at it, your team is going to get into a flow state where the amount of story point value you put on something is going to start to approach an estimate of the amount of time that it takes as well. And that's kind of the point of velocity in and of itself. So step 3, there's a little bit of formulation going on here. So if you're working on a project, for example, and this step 3 is not necessary if you're not working on a project. If you're doing small change, just kind of miscellaneous tasks, this is probably not necessary. If you're working in completely like greenfield, you're just exploring the market and seeing like what works and what doesn't, what do people think is cool, it's probably not necessary. But if you have a certain defined scope of a project or a feature or an epic, sometimes as they're called, that you're working on, what you can do is sum up the total story points in the entire project. Now, this does require a technique that's basically called story brainstorming. There's some other approaches to it, but you want to go through and Go through the whole total scope of your project and have your team work on estimating all of the future work as much as is known, at least. And then that's where you would get this total number of story points. So that is something that is not covered in this chapter, but I would sneak that into a kickoff for a large feature or a project. So one of the early activities that your team engages in when just starting on that new project. Once you have the total number of the story points, here's a little pro tip is multiply it by 1.2. That's just to estimate for unplanned work that's going to happen. You know, it might be that you discover additional user stories that you didn't initially think of in the kickoff of your project planning. It might also be that your team got distracted by, small, higher priority tasks, maybe production support tasks, etc. So it's just adding a buffer for the purposes of thinking about what's the total size of your project. And if you want to adjust the 1.2, you want to do like 1.1, you want to do 1.3, that's totally up to you. 1.2 is just kind of the out-of-box default value that I would recommend. So now you've got your total project as you've known the scope, and you've given some buffer for the unknown. Simply take your team's velocity and divide that total body of work by your team's velocity, and now you've calculated how many sprints to complete the project. And this translates into, of course, basically a date on when the last code gets deployed for your project. Keep in mind that for features, projects, etc., there might be go live activities that you need to account for as well. And you might need to align with other business units for marketing purposes or for just coordinating changes across multiple systems. Also coordinating user training if there's significant changes and your users need to be notified about how things work now. All of those things are important for you to think about. But with step 3, you can calculate when does all the core development work complete, and then you know when you can roughly schedule those kinds of activities. At the beginning of the project, it's going to be less certain, and as you get closer and closer to the end, you're going to have more and more confidence in that end date. Which brings us to step 4. Be cautious about how you share this information outside of the team. Manage good relationships with your customers and stakeholders. So we also say the old adage, under-promise and over-deliver. Don't abuse that, but the whole point is that you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you've shared a date before you were forced to, before you're absolutely forced to, because people are going to start to hold you to that. And in software projects, something might come up, and now you have another 2 weeks you have to tack on, or maybe another 4 weeks to tack on. Scrum teams are oftentimes working in these 2-week chunks, and so it's easy for something to become a half a month or a month late, so to speak. But it didn't have to have the perception of being late if you didn't let the cat out of the bag early. So talk about what quarter or what month you're trending towards, but make sure that you stay a little bit wishy-washy as much as you possibly can, unless you are forced to commit to a date. That's my recommendation there. And that's how you use velocity. So that's about all there is to it. Honestly, it's a lot simpler than oftentimes it gets made out to be. Final thoughts. I do have some counterpoints to story points. No pun intended. I always used to make this joke. Scrum is like, whose line is it anyway? The user stories are made up and the points don't matter. And, well, that's maybe a little bit more of a harsher criticism, I guess, of the framework. So there is some truth to this. So I guess what it means is that once you've had some projects under your belt, you'll start to realize that these estimates, um, accurate estimating, is only one of many factors that help a project to come in on time. And I talked about things taking one or two extra sprints. That's actually pretty good in the software world. Um, Projects can become very, very late. They can become way, way late. People have no idea when it's actually going to be done, and they just start trying to arbitrarily throw completion dates out there that can't be met. Um, One of the things that's nice about the story points is that it helps you to have an actual framework for giving a sort of realistic, somewhat realistic understanding of when work will be completed. But the thing that gets your project done on time is not an accurate estimate necessarily. It's all the other stuff that you end up doing. It's making sure that you have requisitioned the right software tools, physical tools, the right human resources, um, and making sure that you have your dependencies well covered. If you need other teams to help you out, making sure that you're getting out ahead of those things and giving professional courtesy to other groups so you don't interrupt their plans by letting them know what you need from them in advance as much as possible. And it's through a lot of that human relationship management, just being a good hub of sharing information about what your team is working on and what you need from others and what to expect about it. Those are the things that really drive agile projects to meeting those estimates. If you neglect those things, your estimates, they fall apart very quickly. And so that's why I say that the user stories are made up and the points don't matter. Another thing about this is I've tracked the statistics on this over a number of different agile teams and different industries. And as your team starts to get into a flow, you get used to working with each other, you get used to the topic that you're working on. Um, and you have consistency in who is writing your user stories and how the team refines those requirements and ultimately brings them in to work on. Your team is going to meet this sort of bell curve point in which you've reached the cruising altitude for your velocity of your team. You're starting to get consistency in the velocity, and you're starting to also have consistency in approximately how many points the average story is over a length of time. And I've seen it usually end up trending in threes or fives, depending on the team, which is just the middle points, right? Because small, tedious tasks are not necessarily super desirable to have a bunch of those. And then really big, ambiguous tasks like 8s and 13s, they're also not great. They can be underestimated sometimes, and they end up taking a lot longer than you thought, or they just end up being a real grind, and they're kind of painful to work on. So teams, in my experience, will usually end up trending towards mostly threes and fives on average. And likewise, when you reach your velocity average, you're going to be executing about the same number of user stories per person. You'll just sort of reach this state of equilibrium, in which case work item count, the actual just number of tickets that your team commits to, ends up being the same formula. It gives you the same result as doing all of the number crunching for story points and velocity, but it's just simpler and easier to do in your head. And that's a little bit of a controversial topic. I'm going to just go ahead and let you know right now. So I've had a lot of people really dislike thinking that you could use anything but a story point for estimating. So if you disagree with that, I'd be curious to know your thoughts. Please leave a comment. But if you are in a position to do so, I would recommend start trending those things yourself. Trend story points and velocity over time for your team, and trend simply user story work item count over time, and look at if they give you the same level of predictability in your team's ability to complete projects and for your ability to complete sprint plannings. I've found that it actually works. But yeah. Now that being said, I've brought this whole counterpoint and criticism to story points, and I want to let you know that every team that I've ever coached, we've done story point estimating on. It is something that I definitely use in practice because there are a lot of benefits to it. And so let me bring, just kind of in closure, some of the things that I think are the best value that you get out of story pointing your work. So first off, we already talked about this, but it grants you the ability to estimate project delivery dates. Without consistency in your velocity, and without a team that's mature enough to reach that equilibrium state, you're not going to know when stuff gets done. So this is a really great technique that's going to help you to be able to understand what does your roadmap realistically look like for a product or for a team. Now, the other thing is that within a sprint planning session, it allows individual members of the team to discuss differences of opinion on the user story size. So when developer A thinks this is a 5-pointer and developer B thinks, oh, it's an 8-pointer, there's a difference in what they're thinking about is the scope and level of effort. And so that can be a prompt to facilitate discussion among the team about, why does B think it's bigger than A? And let's talk about the details of that. Maybe A is like, oh, I wasn't thinking about those extra tasks that I needed to do. Maybe B is saying, thinking that it's more complicated than it is, and A says, we just need to do this, actually. It's a lot easier than you thought. It's really good to get clarity among the group on what that actual size is. And we'll go into in a future episode of this book report that some of the techniques that we use to get a group consensus on user stories. There's a technique called pointing poker, which is very popular. And there's a lot of digital tools to do that nowadays. So you can even do it with virtual teams. But you basically want to get sort of a group consensus on what the user story size is. Another benefit is that it allows discussion for ancillary scope. Things like, what does it take to test this? What does it take to actually deploy this? Do we need, something else? Do we need another team? Do we need back-end and front-end concerns to be addressed simultaneously? Are there database things that need to be done? There are all these other aspects that are really important. Bringing it back to the dog analogy, we don't just want to think on how long does it take us to write the code itself for this. There are other tasks that are embedded underneath the user story that all need to be taken into consideration for what is its size. And lastly, it helps you determine how much work to commit to in sprint planning. So, it's just good to be able to use your velocity for those purposes. Like I said, it's not the only way to do this, but it is a really good out-of-box technique that is fairly easy to teach, fairly easy to get going, and if it works for you, it's very popular on many teams, so it's transferable. You learn it one place, you'll fit right in with other teams because it's a very popular framework. So yeah, there are some alternate techniques as well. The next chapter of this book is going to go over ideal days, which is a technique I haven't actually used in practice, so I don't know if I'll have a whole lot of commentary on that, but that there are other ways of thinking about how to estimate the size of work, and this is just one of them. So, I don't know. That brings us to the end of the presentation. That's what we've got on user story points. So, Hopefully that cleared up some things for you if you thought of them as a mystery. If you have any questions, I will definitely respond to comments. Please feel free to leave a comment. And thank you very much for tuning in.